Overwhelming response to this lecture. We had planned for about 100 less of you, and we're very grateful that everyone is here. This lecture, I'm Priscilla Clarkson, Dean of Commonwealth Honors College, and this lecture is part of our 4-lecture-a-semester honors faculty lecture series. So there are 3 more outstanding lectures, and on the second, third, and fourth one we'll be more prepared with more chairs. At any rate, I'm very pleased now to introduce Brian Dulock, who's the coordinator of the Honors Seminar Series and the Honors Seminar itself, and he will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Priscilla. Here are only a few very representative samples of the many evaluations made anonymously by students with regard to David Lenson and his teaching. I quote, "One of the most incredible professors that I've ever had. He will change your perspective on things and shake up your world. Lenson is absolutely brilliant. His books are messed up, but so interesting. The man is a genius and has such intelligent things to say. His class blew my mind. It was super interesting. The epitome of badassery. His Brave New World class is incredible. It redefined the way I will think forever. Lenson is the man, and I suggest that anyone take his class if they really want a different perspective on how to think about the world. This guy honestly changed my life. Could be the smartest professor on campus. Lectures are always interesting. A week ago, he talked about sex for 50 minutes, but it wasn't gross or disgusting." A direct quote from Lenson, "I can talk as long as necessary on any subject." Lectures don't completely connect with the current novel, but what he says is so interesting that it doesn't matter. Topics range from the Ayatollah to drug use to New Jersey. Hands down, the greatest professor ever conceived from this school, literally whelped from the loins of UMass. Lenson, you are God in a metaphorical sense, unquote, on all that, and so on. David Lenson is the son of the late Michael Lenson, artist and director of murals projects for the Works Progress Administration in New Jersey. His mother, the late June Lenson, was a marketing research executive. David attended Princeton University from 1963 to 71, where he received 3 degrees and began teaching at UMass in 1971, where he is currently professor of comparative literature and director of the program. He's a former president of the Massachusetts Society of Professors, which is the faculty union at UMass, and former editor of the Massachusetts Review. He has published 2 books in his original field, The Theory of Tragedy, Achilles' Choice from Princeton University Press, and The Birth of Tragedy, a commentary, as well as 2 books of poetry, The Gambler and Ride the Shadow. Here's a short one from Ride the Shadow, called Cannibal Love Song. I can imagine you with your arms clasped together, holding a sprig of parsley in your fingers. I can imagine your head thrown back with an apple in your mouth and rings of pineapple around your neck. I can imagine you with cream and honey in the morning, a little nutmeg like freckles on your tan skin. I can imagine you tufted with frost for summer, fresh from the icebox. In the October rain, I will drink you warm with lemon and brown sugar. I can imagine gnawing on your leg in barbecue sun, or in salads with green peppers and red tomato clashing with the orange of fresh carrots. I can imagine noshing you through a 3-reel movie. I follow you with my eyes when you move along, because you are a month of gluttony. I can imagine you served in 3-star restaurants with a string quartet playing Brahms in the background, but I love you even with mustard on a roll. Meanwhile, David Lenson is best known, however, yes, for On Drugs from the University of Minnesota Press, a one-of-a-kind examination of drugs, drug users, the uses of drugs, and the pervasiveness of drugs in contemporary culture. It's become a cult book and is shortly coming out in a second edition. A more or less professional sax player since 1959, he's played with many blues stars, including Buddy Guy, Junior Wells, Ed Vadas, and John Lee Hooker, and currently plays 100 gigs a year with the Reprobate Blues Band. Find them on YouTube. And now, without further delay, here he is to corrupt the youth of Commonwealth Honors College, David Lenson.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Dean Clarkson. Thanks to all my friends on the faculty of Commonwealth College. I don't know, would you go on after an intro like that? I mean, there's not much there's not much I can do to live up to that introduction, and I have no hope of really doing so, so let's just flail ahead. Thank you all for being here. This is an astounding turnout. I mean, I feel like an associate vice provost or something. This is absolutely amazing. I'm giddy with the power of it all, as I would be if I worked in Whitmore. I'm not really an expert in Plato, but comparative literature has a way of picking up things that other people have discarded. When the psych department got sick of Freud and Jung, we took them in and gave them a home. When people like, when idealist philosophy went down the tubes, we took in Kant and Hegel and Schopenhauer and Schelling and all those people when philosophy became analytical and didn't want to do that anymore. So Plato, in a way, although not discarded by any means by philosophy, has had an impact that goes so far beyond it that we worry about it and deal with it because Plato's impact on so many aspects of modern life is so great. The title of this talk comes from a poem by D.H. Lawrence, one of his last poems he wrote shortly before his death in 1929. The name of the poem is "For the Heroes Are Dipped in Scarlet." And the first couple of lines of it are very famous, the rest of it not so famous and maybe not even so good. Before Plato told the great lie of ideals, men slimly went like fishes and didn't care. They had long hair like Samson, and clean as arrows they sped at the mark when the bow cord twanged. They knew it was no use knowing their own nothingness, for they were not nothing. So now they come back. Hark, hark, the low and shattering laughter of bearded men with the slim waists of warriors and the long feel of moonlit dancers. Oh, and their faces scarlet like the dolphin's blood. Lo, the loveliest is red all over, rippling vermilion as he ripples upwards, laughing in his black beard. They are dancing. They return as they went, dancing. For the thing that is done without the glowing of a god, vermilion, were best not done at all. How glistening red they are. So who are these creatures that Lawrence sees coming back? He sees coming back the creatures who were suppressed by Plato and by Platonic thought, not just in Plato's time, but for all of the ensuing history. The thing with the ideals that he refers to, the great lie of ideals, is sometimes the same as the great lie of ideas, because the Platonic ideas are these transcendental powers that of which everything that we see and know in this world is but a shadow. There are in the world all kinds of cats running around, little kitties coming and going. They are just nothing. They're simply little shadows, just worldly, temporary, transient things of the great eternal category of cat. Everything in the world is like that. This lectern, for example, is simply the incidental and accidental earthly phenomenal manifestation of that great noumenal lectern that exists in the transcendental world. That is what Plato means by ideas. And the ideas that work in his metaphysics are also the ideals that work in his ethics and in his aesthetics and in his social thought. I must say, first of all, because I'm going to say some nasty things about Plato in the course of this lecture, that I understand that his is our first civil liberties case, the first blatant example of somebody who was assassinated by the state for simply saying things that they didn't like. In fact, it may be worse than that even. It may be that they didn't even listen to him or understand him particularly. They just didn't like the fact that he told everybody else how stupid they are. He was arrogant, obviously. He was extremely self-confident. He was socially awkward. He probably never took a bath. He walked around all day. He didn't do anything constructive. And he was probably an asshole. Now, you know, is that enough reason to put somebody to death? You know, to get rid of pompous assholes? They put all those to death. University faculties would be decimated. It would be a horrible, horrible thing, and nobody would want that to happen. So I've got to say, first of all, that I do not, no matter what I think of Plato, I'm horrified by the fact that this was the fate that befell him. It's not that I wouldn't want to headbutt him, but I wouldn't want him to kill him either, on the other hand. There are three problems, as far as I can tell, in Plato. They all impinge a little bit on education, because he addresses the questions of education quite frequently. And in fact, that section you read from the 7th book of the Republic has to do with education, even though it doesn't seem to. He says at the beginning it does, and at the end he ties up the bow with another statement about education. But in between is an allegory that could in some sense be an allegory of what it's like for us living in a shadowland, while reality lies forever unperceived and imperceivable. So the problems are first of all, a political problem. Second, the problem of the Socratic method itself as a mode of inquiry. And the third problem is the whole question of Plato's theology, what these ideals or these ideas are. Here I turn to one of the best commentators on Plato I know, Bertrand Russell, in his History of Philosophy, which I recommend to you as a fantastic introduction. Whenever you're assigned a philosophical text in a class, it never hurts to read Russell's chapter on it, because he's invariably brilliant and very funny. He's a very good philosopher, and he takes nobody, he has reverence for nobody, finally. Russell explains that Plato was an aristocrat. He was born in the early years of the Peloponnesian War. He was a young man when Athens was defeated, and he could attribute that defeat to democracy, which his social position and his family connections were likely to make him despise. He was a pupil of Socrates, for whom he had a profound affection and respect, and Socrates was put to death by democracy. I mean, it's a vote that's taken to put him to death. Plato possessed the art to dress up illiberal suggestions in such a way that they deceived future ages, which admired the Republic without ever being aware of what was involved in its proposals. It has always been correct to praise Plato, but not to understand him. This is the common fate of great men. My object, Russell says, and mine tonight too, is the opposite. I wish to understand him, but would treat him with as little reverence as if he were a contemporary English or American advocate of totalitarianism. Now, that sounds like an extreme statement, and you probably, only a few of you have probably read the Republic all the way through. But if you do, that's exactly what you'll find. You will discover a world ruled by an inner sanctum of philosopher kings, people who have been given by the powers of reason to understand the transcendental world of ideas, and who come and sit with the rest of us and try to enlighten us about those. The image in the 7th book that I think you did read, where the person who is allowed to turn around and see all of the fires and see all of the little objects that these men behind are parading in front to create the Shadowland. Some of them are then turned around and put back to sit among the people in the shadows, the people who see nothing but shadows. But they know better now. They know that everything they see around them in the world, you, me, all of us, this room, this university, is nothing but shadows. It's all transient, changing, meaningless. And therefore, it becomes very difficult for those who have seen the eternal and seen the unchanging and the perfect to put up with this shadowland in which we all live. Now, what is Socrates talking about here? They come back and they have this greater knowledge, and it is their job then to organize the other people around them according to what they have learned by this greater knowledge. But the others they speak to will never understand it. The man that comes back and sits in Shadowland after seeing the fire is no one other than Socrates himself. That is why people misunderstand him. That's why they think he's incomprehensible. That's why they think he's arrogant. That's why they think he's an asshole. It's simply because he's seen something else. Now, did he see it or did he just reason it? And that's a problem with that passage in the Republic that we'll get to later. Russell again talks about these enlightened guardians who return to Shadowland to rule us. Plato begins by deciding that the citizens are to be divided into three classes: the common people, the soldiers, and the guardians. The last alone are to have political power. There are to be much fewer of them than the other two classes. Well, here you've got, the military on the one hand, the unenlightened masses of Shadowland, and then this class of guardians who have some kind of enlightenment, who get to rule over everybody else. You will notice, if you've read George Orwell's 1984, that that's precisely the way the society, the tyrannical society there is organized. There's the inner party and the outer party and the proles. The people that really know what's going on, the people that do their work for them, and then all of these proletarians that they don't care about, whose salvation doesn't really matter to them in the slightest. But also what Russell was thinking, writing between the two wars when he wrote the history of philosophy, he was also thinking of the rise of Adolf Hitler, whom he was very concerned about, because Hitler too divided the world into the military, the inner party, and then all these great masses of people that he not only didn't care about, but actively exterminated. He was also thinking about Joseph Stalin and the function of the Communist Party in Russia, and the fact that the party was detached from the masses, lived a different lifestyle than the masses did, because they had some sort of Bolshevik enlightenment, which enabled them to see things that nobody else could see. The Guardians have a prerogative which is startling for somebody who seems so obsessed with telling the truth as Socrates is. Socrates will tell you, as you read through the Republic, that the guardians, the people who are ruling, the philosopher kings, have the right to lie to the people. They get to lie to them whenever they want. They can tell, as Hitler put it in Mein Kampf, if you tell the same lie over and over and over again, it becomes truth. And this is precisely the course of action that Socrates recommends in this world. Not only that, but this world is to be culturally deeply impoverished. Once again, Russell, who summarizes the practice of censorship here perfectly well. There's to be a rigid censorship from the very early years over the literature to which the young have access and the music they are allowed to hear. Mothers and nurses are to tell their children only authorized stories. Homer and Hesiod will not be allowed for a number of reasons. First, they represent the gods as behaving badly on occasion, which is unedifying. The young must be taught that evils never come from the gods, for God is the author, not only the author of all things, but only of good things. Second, there are things in Homer and Hesiod that are calculated to make their readers fear death, whereas everything ought to be done in education to make young people willing to die in battle. Third, decorum demands that there should never be loud laughter, yet Homer speaks of inextinguishable laughter among the blessed gods. How is a schoolmaster to reprove mirth effectively, if boys can quote this passage? Fourth, there are passages in Homer praising rich feasts and others describing the lusts of the gods. Such passages discourage temperance. Then there must be stories in which the wicked are happy or the good unhappy. The moral effect on tender minds might be most unfortunate. On all these counts, the poets are to be condemned. Plays, if permissible at all, must contain no characters except faultless male heroes of good birth. The impossibility of this is so evident that Plato decides to banish all the dramatists from the city. Well, in the Stalin Soviet Union in 1936 came a decree from the Central Board that censored writings, and the decree announced that there would be no more middle characters, that every character in every work of literature had to be totally good or totally bad, and they couldn't have anybody in between that would be torn by contrary forces. This made for a kind of literature that was very Manichaean. It was just the good versus the bad, a very simple battle in which, needless to say, only the good, the Bolsheviks, were ever allowed to win. So in this, this is the vision that Plato has, that he has Socrates present to us. Remember, Socrates is a literary character himself, oddly enough, who wants to condemn all literary characters. He's a literary character himself and something of a middle character. Would he allow himself as the creation of Plato in the world in which he's describing? Probably he shouldn't, because he has his own faults. He wants to talk and reason, and he cares nothing about the world around him. Socrates never talks about cats, dogs. He never talks about chairs, about the sunset. He does talk about the stars, but he's interested in them for the sort of cosmology that their mathematics suggests to him. He doesn't talk about the objects of the world. In the symposium, he drinks all night with the rest of the partiers. And in the morning, they're all passing out. And Socrates gets up, dusts himself off, and goes to work. Goes right back outside to have philosophical discussions all day. Aristophanes, one of the characters, has been trying to have sex with Socrates for years and years and years and years. And he keeps trying and trying and trying. And Socrates keeps putting him off and putting him off. And you know what? Aristophanes never gets to have sex with Socrates. In fact, nobody ever does. Least of all, perhaps his wife, Xanthippe, who appears only once in a while to shriek at him, like, why don't you get a job, for Christ's sakes, and get some money? Xanthippe comes in the Phaedo, the dialogue where Socrates actually drinks the hemlock and dies. And Socrates wants to have in his final moments, what? A philosophical discussion. And Xanthippe comes in crying and mourning for his impending death, and he says, take her out of here, for God's sakes. You know, I want to have, we have important philosophical issues to discuss here. And so all of the things that make human beings so changeable, so fleshly, so earthly, are things that Socrates despises, both in himself and in everyone else. The soul must always take prevalence over the body, and he makes sure that it does. It's because the body is a transient object. It is but a shadow of the type of the body that exists somewhere in that pure world beyond the senses, somewhere in that world of ideas and ideals. So the first count on which you can complain about Socrates is certainly on political grounds, because if you have a world that's governed only by people that claim to have some elite and transcendental knowledge that they not only can't tell anybody about, but will lie about when asked point blank, then you're going to have a world of a kind of totalitarianism that seems quite utterly out of place in ancient Greece. Not that Greece didn't have tyrants, but the word tyrannos doesn't mean what tyrant means in the modern world. Most Greek cities flipped back and forth between tyrants and democracies. Russell asserts in his book that Plato got his inspiration not from Athens at all, but from Sparta, that city of great deprivation, of militarism seen to the nth degree. And this is the first problem with Plato, is that he has left a legacy of totalitarian thought that we have never, ever lived down completely. Now, how does he go about arguing all this stuff? You know, Russell says so nicely that he has a way of putting illiberal sentiments over on us in such a way that we accept them or take them seriously. He does this by something called the Socratic method. And the Socratic method still is a word that has some resonance as an educational method. I can't tell you how many colleagues of mine over the decades have come up to me and goes, you know, I don't lecture. I said, huh? What, you don't lecture? He says, yeah, well, I don't want to just inflict my opinion on the students, you know. I said, yeah, I know what you mean. Lecturing really bites. Nobody likes lecturing. It's stupid. And I say, well, you know, instead, I want the Socratic method, because that way I can exchange ideas with the students, you know, across a classroom. I can invite them into the subject matter. They get involved. I ask them questions, and they ask me questions. Well, this would be a nice idea if that's what the Socratic method was, if it was like inviting you to explore your way into the subject, but that's not the way Socrates practices it. First of all, except in certain early works, like the Ion, where Ion, who's a rhetor, he recites Homeric poems for a living as a source of enlightenment and entertainment to his audiences. As part of his program of opposition to poetry, Socrates has this dialogue with Ion in which he tries to persuade him that art is even worse than the physical world, because if we and everything we see around us are just copies of ideals, then what is art? Art is copies of copies. It is mimesis. We make copies of copies, and so every time we make a work of art, we compound the problem. We get farther and farther away from the ideal. We get farther and farther away from the eternal, and deeper into the temporal and changing. So, you know, this is a kind of a frightening thought. But, you know, so at least Ion gives him a good argument. Ion's not afraid of Socrates. And sure, Socrates wins, but it's a hard-fought battle. The later you get in Plato's works, the more the antagonists that Socrates had are complete buffoons. And this is funny in the case of the Republic, like in the 7th book, the antagonist, who's a complete sheep, is named Glaucon. And who's Glaucon but the older brother of Plato himself? You wonder, God, did Plato really intend that? Is he really making fun of his brother? Or listen to Crito, you know, Socrates is putting down all these ideas to which you could find, and I can find, a lot of objections. Does Crito come up with a single objection? No. Come now, says Socrates. If we ruin that which is improved by health and corrupted by disease by not following the opinions of those who know, is life worth living for us when that's ruined? And that is the body, is it not? Crito, yes. Socrates, is life worth living with a body that is corrupted and in bad condition? In no way, says Crito. Life isn't worth living if your body's in bad condition. Never mind, you know, that we are more sensitive to people with physical challenges than people were in those days. But this is a military nation. Athens has been in war after war. The place is populated with wounded veterans. How can he say that about them? And how can Crito let that pass without uttering a single objection? And is life worth living for that part of us which is corrupted, that unjust action harms and just action benefits? Or do we think that part of ourselves, whatever it is, that is concerned with justice and injustice, is inferior to the body? He goes, well, you know, if you don't want to live with a bad body, do you want to live with a bad soul? And Crito goes, not at all. He falls right in. Is it more valuable? Is the soul more valuable than the body? And Crito goes, much more. We should not think so much of what the majority will say about us, but what he will say who understands justice and injustice, the one that is, and the truth itself. So that, in the first place, you are wrong to believe that we should care for the opinion of the many about what is just, beautiful, and good, and their opposites. But someone might say, the many are able to put us to death. Crito goes, that too is obvious, Socrates. Someone will say so. So here it is. What does he offer as an objection to any of these things? Nothing. Neither does Glaucon in the Republic. Neither do the antagonists in almost all of the other works. He just keeps asking questions, what lawyers would call leading questions. If somebody does this to you when you're in the witness stand, your lawyer better jump up and say, objection, Your Honor. The attorney is leading the witness. You know, you can't do that in a court of law. Just say, you know, one little obvious thing, another little obvious thing, and slowly you reel the person into incriminating themselves, or in this case, taking the opinion that Socrates had all along. The problem with the Socratic method as a pedagogy is that just as surely as a lecturer, it will bludgeon you with his opinions and force you to sit there passively while you're hit over the head with them. No more so, the Socratic method knows the conclusion that it wants to reach, as certainly as a lecturer does, and will slowly, gradually lure you in until you give your consent to it. Sometimes that consent comes without you really having time or occasion to exercise your full judgment on it. It means that fundamentally that you are using what appears to be the art of persuasion in order to bring somebody over to your side completely. That's one of my other problems, is that why didn't Plato give Socrates some worthy antagonists if Socrates is so good as he's supposed to be? The Socratic method is just a kind of veiled authoritarianism in the classroom. It is only the professor has the right answer. He always has it because he's had a glimpse of the eternal world of unchanging truth. And gradually you, in the shadowland, will be drawn closer and closer to the light of that eternal substance, bit by bit. All evidence to the contrary. Even though everything you say and think up to that point may run you in a different direction, you will be lured in. And you know, this has infected all of us to some degree. The hardest sentence for a college professor to say, and I can barely bring myself to say it now, it's like ripping my guts out, is, I don't know. We just can't say it. It's impossible. It seems like we disgrace ourselves. We say things like, it is not known. We say, scholars have widely varying opinions on this subject, and you would have to do years of research before you could make that judgment for yourself. So, you know, we wiggle out of it, but you'll never, I bet you can get all the way through UMass without hearing a faculty member say, I don't know. It's impossible. And certainly that part of that arrogance of it all is a legacy of Socrates and of Plato. Now, the ostensible subject of the seventh part of the seventh book of the Republic, which you read, is education. He starts it out by saying, next, I said, compare the effect of education and the lack of it on our nature to an experience like this. And then he gives you that, the famous parable of the cave where everyone's sitting there and you're just watching like shadow puppetry on the wall. And because you're chained in place, you believe that the shadow puppets are real, and you never can turn around and see what the source of the light or where the shadows are coming from are. So you are living, as we are all living apparently, according to Plato and Socrates, in a world of perpetual darkness and shadows. The particular guy who sees the light and gets turned around, even gets dragged out of the cave into the sunlight, is doing something that really Socrates ordinarily says is impossible. The ideas or the ideals are invisible. You can't see them, you can't smell them, you can't taste them, you can't touch them. They're beyond the senses. They live not in the phenomenal world, but in the noumenal world. They're beyond all of that. So why is it that he lets this hypothetical character actually see it? Well, that person is seeing it not with their eyes, not with their senses. You envision the eternal only with the organ of reason. And that reason you will reason about. You're allowed to reason about the ideas and the ideals. You're allowed to think about them and make philosophical arguments about them, but you're never really going to see them. But, you know, if you do that, then you can persuade everybody else that you know something about them in an immediate way that nobody else knows. Socrates thinks that other people find him confused and confusing, but he thinks they're confused. He thinks that they're confused for caring about the world and its changeable objects. Even in Plato's own terms, a sensory enlightenment of that kind is impossible, since the world of ideas cannot be perceived. So here again, he appears to violate his own principles when he makes that example, but it's a metaphorical kind of seeing. It's like the seeing that the mind makes in piercing through that magical veil. The problem then is when you talk about the ideas and the ideals, that they persuade us that we are in fact nothing. And if we exercise the path of the philosophers, we might be able to reason about the world as it exists beyond the veil in such a way that we will become enlightened slightly or educated slightly. Now, Socrates' great contradiction is he always goes around saying, the one thing that makes me smarter than everybody else is that I don't know anything, but I know that I don't know anything, whereas everybody else thinks they know something and they really don't. Hence the line in the lines in Lawrence poem, they knew it was no use knowing their own nothingness, for they were not nothing. And sure enough, when you think of the effect that this ignoring of the sensory world could have on philosophy and could have on all of the conduct of human life, we better be thankful that one of Plato's own students, Aristotle, turned against this point of view in every way possible. Aristotle founded empirical science by doing precisely what Socrates or Plato would never do. He goes out and looks at things. He looks at birds. He looks at flowers. He looks at literary works. He looks at tragedies. He looks at epics. He looks at comedies. He goes out curious in the world, and he sends his students out curious about the world around him. This is something that Socrates would never do. Were it not for Aristotle's intervention, then that second mode of instruction, the empirical sciences, would never have come into existence, or would have been much delayed. Socrates would have provided an impediment to precisely that kind of investigation. So here we are at this point with the good old Socratic method being a kind of passive-aggressive motion, which it really is. I mean, but the Crito is a very passive-aggressive work, I think, for example. And it kind of prepares us for something else that comes later. You will notice as you read through Plato that Socrates sometimes refers to gods and sometimes refers to God. It's clear that in his mind he wants to move towards a monotheistic view of the world, because these eternal perfect things, the ideas of the ideals, cannot have been created by anything but a perfect eternal creature. And the Greek gods are not perfect. They're not even exactly eternal. The Greek gods do things like fornicate, they rape human beings, they drink too much, they get wounded, they make terrible mistakes, they fight with each other. And worse yet, worse than all these things, sometimes they actually appeared. People in Greek literature will sometimes say, hey, you know what? I just saw Athena. Oh, no kidding. Where? Down by the crossroads. Really? You saw Athena? You know, that's sort of like saying, I just saw Justin Timberlake. You know, where? In Cumbies. It's like, but for them, people would say stuff like that, and you wouldn't think they were crazy. So I really did. I saw Athena down there. I go, The gods were local. The gods were anthropomorphic. They looked like people. They acted like people. They're gods that were a lot like us. Whereas Socrates seems to want to move us towards what Aldous Huxley called the God that is wholly other, something that's so totally different from us that we can never form a single idea of it. For such must have been the deity that would have created these unchanging, perfect archetypes of all experience. And there's no doubt that once Christianity comes along, it profits from Socrates' work enormously. If you read the Phaedo, where he actually drinks the hemlock and actually dies, never stopping his Socratic method to the last breath, you will see the prototype for St. Paul in the Gospels and the crucifixion of Jesus. Both Jesus and Socrates have this in common. They are creatures who, out of a love of humanity, took their seat back in the shadowland, though they knew the transcendental world. Jesus became incarnate in order to show us that the possibility of salvation lay even in our transient human bodies, even in this sad and fallen world in which we live. Socrates, similarly, wants to show us that a person can be enlightened by reason and still come and be among us for a while. even though it is, when his body goes, he will live on in some other form. Socrates doesn't get resurrected as Jesus does, but there's no question that this is the case. From Pauline theology all the way up through Aquinas and Augustine, it's all Platonism warmed over again. Christianity is the realization of the thing that Socrates could not quite say, that there is just one God, that God is good, and that God is eternal. And therefore, in the Divine Comedy, when Dante starts down into the Inferno in Book 4, he comes to a place called the Circle of the Virtuous Pagans. They were people that would have been saved if they'd lived after Jesus, but they can't be admitted to Paradiso because they lived before Jesus was born. Dante goes, "Then, when a little more I raised my brow, I spied the master of the sapient throngs, seated among the philosophic train. Him all admire and pay him reverence due. There, Socrates and Plato, both I marked." Now, at the very end, when he's about to go down from the hemlock, Socrates says something that sounds pretty harmless to Crito. His last words are, "Oh yeah, and please remember to sacrifice a cock to Asclepius." Now, when did people sacrifice roosters to this god Asclepius? Asclepius was a god of health. You went to him to say thank you when you got over the swine flu or something. You'd sacrifice a hen or chicken and give it to Asclepius as a thank you. So why does Socrates want the cock sacrificed to Asclepius? Because he believes now that he's dying, that he's being cured of the disease of life. For he sees life as we live it, life as mutable and changing and fleshly, as a disease from which we must all be cured. And that, I think, is my most compelling problem with Plato and Socrates, is their hatred of the world and their hatred of life itself. Now, we can learn a lot. While you're here at UMass, you'll take a lot of classes that are empirical in nature, where you'll be given a lot of facts and you write them down in notebooks. You'll gobble them all up the night before the final, puke them back up again on the day of the final, and then promptly forget them. You will also occasionally meet one of my colleagues that wants to try out the Socratic method on you, and you'll try to spin the spider's web of that to draw you to his own viewpoints. But I would say, following D.H. Lawrence and that image of men on fire, literally men red with passion and courage and with the dance and with music and everything else, that the best kind of education is the one not that solves problems, not that reasons people away into complacency, but the kind that creates problems, that makes more trouble for us when we try to be intellectually complacent. That, I think, is the real realm where these things should happen. We should live as students in a world of fire and not in a world of shadows. Give us 40, Brian.
Okay. If you want to ask any questions, Professor Lenson, please step right up to the microphone.
And please not, what was Hunter S. Thompson really like? I didn't ask that too much. How about, why couldn't you been 10 minutes shorter? That's a good question. Wow, this is my kind of crowd. You should have the mic on a stick like Oprah.
Here's a question.
Do you think that there's any real point in asking these questions? I mean, it doesn't affect the world that we live in. It's not like in physics where you question why something goes around and then you can put a satellite in orbit. We can't make the world better by wondering why the world is stupid.
That's a good point. Although maybe we can. I mean, there probably are reasons to ask those kinds of questions. But I think we've got to realize that the world is both stupid and marvelous at the same time. It's full of brilliant inspiration and a kind of perpetual inability to live up to those brilliant inspirations. I mean, that's what's so much fun about life. It's, the Gnostics had a theory that the world was created by the one and true perfect creator God, who then, when he was done, just said, well, that's it, Miller time, and then he left for some other part of the universe. And he left the world in charge of a malevolent demiurge, a kind of administrator, sort of associate vice provost. And he left the world in charge of that thing. And that's why the world is so beautiful. And human beings have so much good in them, but everything seems to be so intensely and utterly screwed up all the time. So maybe the Gnostics were right. They read Plato too.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, I'm curious. You've raised some very interesting points about Plato's philosophy, but obviously Plato and Socrates can't exactly respond to that. And the fact remains that Plato is still held up as a very important philosopher. So what would someone who was trying to defend Plato's philosophy say?
Sure. Look, the idea of the forms, or the ideas, he's trying to deal with a problem that all philosophers before him and since have dealt with, the problem of universals. I mean, how do we know? You see, if we had a parade of goats go by, we'd say, well, they're all goats, I guess, but each one's different. One's got a broken horn, one has no horns, one's small, one's big, one has hyphens for eyes. They're all different. What is it that allows us to say that these are all goats? So, I mean, Plato is trying to deal with that question. Like, there must be like an archetypal goat there's somewhere that these guys all approximate. I mean, it's not an easy question to answer, and you could argue that, in fact, that was a very clever attempt to solve the problem of universals. How do we know in a world of particulars what unites things? And probably Aristotle wouldn't have been able to do his fabulous taxonomies of sorting out living creatures into categories if it weren't for something like that. So you could say that would be a good thing. Must be some other good thing to say.
So it's more in the implications of his ideas as opposed to the ideas themselves.
Yeah, and I mean, you could actually make a literary argument for Plato being a very good writer, which is very funny because he's proposing banning all of the creative writers. But Socrates is a vivid character. I mean, he is a middle character. There's a lot of good about him, and there's a lot of bad about him too. So, and that I think is one of the reasons why this work has proved so durable, is that it's sometimes amusing to read.
Thank you.
The problem, and my question kind of continues on what you were saying, but it's more of how to think about these texts, because Plato's just the beginning and we've all just arrived here, and we've got all these ideas coming through that we're just on the brink of understanding. We can get most of it, but then it's just because, I mean, we have such a lack of experience and a lack of context as in life that it's difficult for us to come up with any counter-arguments spontaneously in any text we read. And it's kind of, I feel like I'm sitting here and my brain is just a battleground for the different authors that are disagreeing with each other.
Yeah.
So do you have any advice, any way we could think about these texts, even with our lack of experience, that would let us critical?
I mean, the big problem is that the Socratic method is a series of dead ends. The problem is posed, and Crito goes, "Yeah, you say so, Socrates," and so you get to that point, and that's case closed. Don't let the case be closed. And they say, wait a minute now, Crito, you're just following here. What if you thought of, like what I tried to do with his statement about it's not worth living in a damaged body. How can you say that if you just step back from that and realize you're living in a culture that was profoundly military at times? And where, in fact, Socrates himself had been in the military. Has he forgotten all the people that were wounded there? So if you take a step back and go, wait a minute, the case isn't closed. No, none of these dead ends is really a dead end. Every one of them goes someplace. And that's what I would take away from this: is don't let arguments stop just because they hit one of these stops. Just get around it somehow. And that's what I mean at the end by talking about problematizing as a real mission. Whenever a solution to a problem comes, doubt it, attack it, think it over a second time. That's what I would take away from this.
Hi, so I just have one question on your analysis of Stalin and Plato. And I was wondering, because Plato and Stalin seem to have the same ideology, if it is correlation and that they just happen to use the same equation or formula that works for people oppressing other people, or if perhaps Plato and other infamous dictators actually made a study of Plato as a reliable text.
Well, I don't doubt it, actually. I mean, when you look at many of these, the engineers of the great 20th century totalitarianisms, almost all of them were pretty well read. Like, what people don't know, I mean, Stalin came up from Georgia, the province, Georgia, and he made his name as a bank robber. He was robbing banks to finance the operations of the Bolshevik revolutionaries down in that area, and that's what brought him to the attention of Lenin and others. But when they got there, they discovered that Stalin had a pretty good training in linguistics. And in fact, he was so good at linguistics, he kicked 2 letters out of the Russian alphabet. And that's practical linguistics at its best, And when you think of Mao Zedong, who was probably one of the most powerful followers of Stalin in that methodology, he forbade people to write in classical Chinese, but he was one of the greatest poets of the 20th century writing in classical Chinese. Similarly, Marx was very well educated. He went to good German universities where he studied with the students of Hegel. Lenin was a voracious reader that just read everything he could lay his hands on. Engels was an excellent anthropologist, and these people are not ignorant of philosophical history. I mean, Marx was trained as a philosopher and rebelled against that training because philosophy couldn't really change the world. He wanted to come up with something that could. So, yeah, I mean, I think this is all conscious to some degree. It's conscious, not just in the loose sense of like a cultural consciousness or the collective unconscious or anything like that. I think these ideas have started here and are easy to trace back. And you can be certain of that. Mein Kampf is, I mean, nobody wants to read Mein Kampf because you don't want to be seen with it on the Sunderland bus, it's not cool. But if you read Mein Kampf, you'll hear echoes of this all over the place.
But just one more question.
Yes.
Okay, oh, it works. Sorry, I wasn't working. You said a big complaint about Plato's writings was that Socrates was always paired up against a buffoon. So, in a kind of philosophical cage death match, who would you like to see against Socrates?
That's a good question. Well, I mean, talking about possibility, I mean, we don't have any records of the conversations that Aristotle had with Plato. That whatever it was that being a student of Plato had for him that caused him to veer away in such a different direction, that's a conversation I'd like to hear. Otherwise, I don't know. I mean, that's a really good question. Maybe one of the great dramatists that could defend the arts, somebody like Aeschylus, somebody with a panoramic vision of Greek culture and Greek history, and someone who believes in the polytheism of the Greek pantheon in a way that Plato obviously doesn't. Somebody who's still got that scarlet blood of the warrior on him a little bit. Socrates is bloodless. I mean, it's just like, let's talk about the good. Let's talk about justice. Let's talk about something else.
Thanks for talking.
Thank you all for being here. It's been great fun.
Why I'm saying now. I'm sure everybody.